The town of Red Dust, New Mexico, clung to the edge of the world like a burr on a dog's back. It was a place built of grit, greed, and the kind of suffocating heat that baked secrets into the adobe walls. Here, a person's worth was measured in the weight of their coin purse or the speed of their draw, and judgment was served cheaper than whiskey. Every glance from a sun-wrinkled face was an appraisal, every murmur a verdict. The air in the rusty Spur Saloon was thickest with it, a foul mix of stale beer, sweat, and unspoken contempt. Tonight, that contempt had a singular focus. Her name was Iris. She stood near the back wall, a slim silhouette against the grime-streaked planks. Her presence a stark, unwelcome flower in a patch of thorny weeds. At 19, her face still held the soft lines of youth, but her eyes were far older. They were the color of a stormy sky over the plains, and they missed nothing. They saw the smirks of the off-duty cowhands, the pitiless curiosity of the prospectors, and the feigned indifference of the bartender, who polished the same spot on the counter for the 10th time. She was the final stake on the table. The game had been going on for hours, a grim war of attrition between two men. On one side sat Silas Croft, a man whose wealth from the silver mines had only widened the cruel streak that ran through him. His face was fleshy and perpetually flushed. His expensive vest strained at the buttons, and his sweat-sheened fingers, adorned with a gaudy turquoise ring, trembled slightly as he arranged his cards. He had been losing steadily, and his mounting frustration had curdled the atmosphere around him. Opposite him sat the stranger. He'd given his name as Jed Knox, and nothing more. He was a wall of a man, with shoulders that seemed to block out the light and a stillness that was more unnerving than any threat. A long, travel-stained duster hung from his frame, its hem caked with the dust of a dozen territories. His face was all sharp angles and shadows under the brim of his hat, and he hadn't spoken more than a dozen words all night. "Call, raise, I'll see you." He played with an unnerving economy of motion, his hands steady, his gaze unwavering. He drank his water, not whiskey, and watched Croft unravel with the detached patience of a hawk watching a rabbit. The pot in the middle of the table was a small fortune in gold eagles and crumpled bills, but Silas Croft had run out of both. His pride, however, was a well that never ran dry. Fueled by whiskey and desperation, he had made his final, contemptible wager. He hadn't announced it with a roar, but with a low, venomous hiss that had silenced the saloon. "I've got one thing left of value," he'd slurred, gesturing with his chin toward Iris. "The girl's indenture. 1 year. She's worth more than this pile of dirt." A collective intake of breath had been the only response, followed by a wave of hushed, excited whispers. It wasn't the first time a woman's fate had been decided over cards in a place like this, but the blatant crudeness of it still sent a ripple through the room. Iris felt the stares land on her like physical blows. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She simply lifted her chin a fraction of an inch, her hands clasped tightly behind her back, her knuckles white. She was a statue of forced composure, her mind a whirlwind of cold, hard reality. This was her life, a series of ledges from which she was perpetually pushed, her only skill being how to land without shattering completely. Jed Knox had looked from Croft's sneering face to Iris. His eyes, for a single, fleeting moment, met hers across the smoky room. There was no pity in them, no outrage, no hint of a savior. There was only a flat, unreadable assessment. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. The indenture papers on the table, then deal the cards. And so it was done. A folded, grease-stained document was placed atop the pile of gold. A human life reduced to ink and paper. The final hand was dealt. The tension in the room was a living thing, coiling in the smoke-filled air. Croft's desperate hope was a sour stench. Jed's silence was a heavy blanket. Croft revealed his hand with a triumphant grunt. 3 queens. A smug, ugly smile spread across his lips. read 'em and weep. Stranger. Jed knocked slowly, deliberately, laid his cards down one by one. An ace, another ace, a king, another king, and a final king. A full house. The silence that followed was absolute. It was broken by a single, dry chuckle from an old prospector in the corner. Then, the dam of decorum burst. Laughter, raw and mocking, filled the saloon. It wasn't directed at Jed, the winner, but at Silas Croft, the loser. In the West, losing your fortune was a misfortune. Losing your pride was a spectator sport. "Looks like your luck's run dry," Croft one man yelled. "Heard his mind's been nothing but gravel for a month," shouted another. The taunt swirled around Croft, who sat frozen, his face a mask of purple rage. He stared at Jed's winning hand as if it were a coiled rattlesnake. His victory, his last chance to assert his dominance, had crumbled to dust. A lean cowhand with a cruel grin looked from Jed to Iris, and then back again, his voice loud enough for the whole room to hear. "Got yourself a prize. Stranger, let's see if you can hold on to her." "He'll drop her by sunrise," another man muttered to his companion, spitting a stream of tobacco juice that sizzled on the hot stove. "That kind is nothing but trouble." Iris heard every word. Each one was a small stone added to the wall she had built around her heart. Trouble. That's what they called a woman who survived. A woman who endured the failings and vices of men and was still standing. She didn't look at them. Her focus was entirely on the two men at the table. Jed Knox didn't smile. He didn't acknowledge the crowd or their jeers. He simply raked the pot toward him with one long arm, his movements unhurried. He separated the indenture papers from the money, folded the document, and tucked it inside his duster. He didn't even glance at it. Enraged and humiliated, Silas Croft shot to his feet, the legs of his chair scraping violently against the floorboards. His eyes, small and bloodshot, were fixed on Iris. He saw not a person, but the embodiment of his defeat. He lunged across the small space between them and grabbed her arm, his thick fingers digging into the flesh of her wrist like a vice. "You belong to me until the debt is paid," he snarled, his voice thick with malice, his breath hot and smelling of whiskey. Iris's gasp was sharp, a sound of pain she couldn't suppress. She tried to pull away, but his grip was iron. She didn't cry out, didn't plead. She met his furious gaze with a look of cold, defiant stillness. This was a familiar pain, a familiar battle of wills. Jed Knox moved. He didn't rise quickly. It was a slow, deliberate unfolding, like a mountain coming to life. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood to his full, imposing height and took one step toward them. That was all it took. His presence filled the space, a silent, deadly promise. His eyes, fixed on Croft's hand on Iris's wrist, were as cold and hard as river stones in winter. The saloon fell quiet again. The mocking laughter died in men's throats. They recognized the air crackling with something far more dangerous than a card game. This was the precipice of violence. Croft, for all his bluster, was not a fool. He was a bully who preyed on the weak, not a man who faced down monoliths. He saw the finality in Jed's stance and the absolute lack of fear or any emotion at all in his eyes, with a final, vicious squeeze that made Iris wince. He released her wrist and shoved her forward. "Take her!" he spat, his voice trembling with fury. "She's a curse. She'll bring you nothing but ruin." He stormed out of the saloon, shoving men out of his way, the bat-wing doors swinging wildly in his wake. For a moment, Iris stood alone in the center of the room, the silence a heavy shroud. On her wrist, the angry red marks of Croft's fingers were already beginning to darken into a bruise. She could feel the weight of every eye in the room on her, a mixture of pity, scorn, and morbid curiosity. They were all waiting to see what would happen next, what the silent stranger would do with his winnings. She straightened her shoulders. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. She turned, not looking at Jed, and began to walk toward the door. Each step was measured, her back straight, her head held high. It was the longest walk of her life, a gauntlet of stares and whispers. The batwing doors swung open before she reached them, pushed by Jed Knox, who had moved past her with the silence of a shadow. He stepped out into the dying light of the afternoon and stopped, leaning against the wooden rail of the boardwalk, his back to the saloon entrance. He didn't look at her. He just waited, his gaze fixed on the dusty street and the distant, heat-shimmering mesas. She paused in the doorway, the warm, foul air of the saloon at her back and the vast, uncertain expanse of the west before her. Her wrist throbbed with a dull, insistent pain. Her future was a blank page, owned by the silent man who now stood waiting for her. He hadn't spoken a word of kindness. He hadn't offered a gesture of comfort. He had simply won a bet. He could be better than Croft, or he could be worse. He was an unknown quantity, a gamble far bigger than the one just played out over a poker hand. She saw the men inside the saloon watching, their faces framed by the swinging doors. They were waiting for her to run. They were waiting for her to cry. They were waiting for Jed to grab her, to claim his property as Croft had tried to do. Iris did none of those things. She looked at the broad, unmoving back of the man in the duster. He hadn't forced her from the saloon. He hadn't spoken to her as if she were a horse he'd won. He had walked out and given her a choice to follow, or not. It was the smallest, most insignificant courtesy, but in her world, it felt as vast as the sky. She took a breath, the dusty air scraping her lungs. Then she stepped out of the saloon and into the light. The doors swung shut behind her, cutting off the whispers and the stares. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the wind whistling through the eaves and the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer. He didn't turn. She stood there, the bruise on her wrist a stark reminder of what she was leaving, the silent man a terrifying symbol of where she was going. She didn't hesitate. She walked the few steps that separated them, her worn boots making soft sounds on the weathered boardwalk. She stopped beside him. He still didn't look at her, but she knew he was aware of her every movement. Slowly, deliberately, Iris raised her hand, the one with the bruised wrist. Without a word, she reached out and placed it gently on the hard muscle of his forearm. It was not a plea for help. It was not a gesture of submission. It was an acceptance, a decision. She had taken his arm. Jed Knox did not acknowledge the soft weight of her hand on his arm, but he did move, with a slight, almost imperceptible nod toward the dusty street. He started walking. Iris matched his stride, her steps hesitant at first, then firming as they moved away from the suffocating judgment of the rusty spur. She didn't look back. There was nothing for her there but a life she was desperate to forget. The batwing doors creaked once more, a final, jeering whisper from the world she was leaving behind. His horse, a sturdy buckskin with intelligent eyes, was hitched to a rail in front of the general store. It was a working animal, not a showpiece, its coat dusty and its gear worn but well-maintained. Jed untied the reins with practiced efficiency. He looked at Iris, then at the horse, his gaze clinical. For a moment, she thought he expected her to walk. A year of indenture could mean anything, and she was prepared for the worst. Instead, he cupped his hands together, a silent offering. It took her a second to understand. He was offering her a step up. Her eyes widened slightly. Men didn't help her, they took from her. This simple, impersonal gesture was so far outside her experience that she felt a flicker of suspicion. But the alternative was to remain in red dust, and that was no alternative at all. She placed her worn boot into his hands, and he lifted her onto the horse's back as if she weighed nothing. He adjusted the stirrups for her without a word, his movements precise and economical. She sat astride the horse, her hands gripping the worn leather of the pommel. He took the reins and began to lead the horse out of town, his long, steady stride eating up the ground. They passed the blacksmith's shop, where the ringing of the hammer fell silent as the smithy stared. They passed the assayer's office and the closed door of the church. Every window seemed to hold a pair of watching eyes. Iris kept her gaze fixed straight ahead. On the broad expanse of Jed's back, the duster he wore was a canvas of unknown roads, a shield between her and the town that had nearly consumed her. Once they cleared the last wretched shanty on the edge of red dust, the silence of the desert descended. It was a profound quiet, broken only by the rhythmic clop of the horse's hooves, the crunch of Jed's boots on the dry, gravelly earth, and the low whisper of the wind through sagebrush and creosote. The sun was a merciless hammer in the vast, bleached blue sky. Heat radiated in shimmering waves from the red earth, and the distant mesas seemed to float on an invisible sea. Jed did not speak. He walked with a purpose that suggested he knew every rock and every thorny cactus of this unforgiving land. Iris watched him from her perch, studying the man who now held the paper title to her life. He was a puzzle of stark contrasts. The raw power in his shoulders and the casual way a heavy-looking pistol was strapped to his hip spoke of a capacity for violence. Yet, he had used none of it. He had faced down Silas Croft with nothing but his own stillness. He had offered her his hands to help her mount his horse. He had chosen to walk in the brutal sun while she rode. Her mind, long accustomed to calculating threats and searching for hidden motives, didn't know what to make of him. Kindness, in her world, was a currency used to purchase something later. It was a baited hook. She waited for the line to be pulled taut, for the demand that would surely follow this strange, silent courtesy. What would he ask for? When would the quiet patience break, and the true nature of her new master reveal itself? She ran a thumb over the tender, bruised skin of her wrist. It was a constant, throbbing reminder of what men were capable of. They traveled for hours. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The landscape grew wilder, the flat plains giving way to rolling hills and jagged rock formations that looked like the bones of the earth. Jed never seemed to tire. His pace was as steady as a clock's tick. He moved through the terrain with an easy familiarity, his silence as much a part of the desert as the stones and the sand. For Iris, the journey was a strange reprieve. The rhythmic motion of the horse was soothing, and the immense, empty landscape was a balm after the claustrophobic confines of red dust. For the first time in a long time, there were no leering eyes on her, no drunken hands to dodge, no oily whispers to endure. There was only the heat, the silence, and the steady, broad back of the man walking before her. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was a familiar companion. What was new was the sliver of uncertainty that accompanied it, the not knowing. As twilight began to bleed the color from the rocks, her focus softened. The exhaustion of the day, of the past year, settled deep into her bones. Her head drooped, and her focus blurred. It was then that the worn-out sole of her left shoe, already hanging on by a thread, finally gave way. As she shifted her weight in the stirrup, it caught on a protruding rock. The leather ripped with a faint, pathetic sound. Her foot slipped, her balance was thrown, and with a startled cry, she tumbled from the horse's back, landing in a heap in the coarse sand. The pain was sharp, a jolt up her ankle, but it was the humiliation that burned hotter. She was clumsy. She was a burden. She immediately pushed herself up, expecting a curse, a rough word, an explosion of the anger she was sure he had been suppressing all day. Jed stopped instantly. He turned, his face an unreadable mask in the growing darkness. The horse took a few steps and then stopped as well, cropping at a patch of dry grass. He walked back to her, his boots making no sound in the soft sand. He looked down at her. Then his gaze dropped to her foot, to the ruined shoe dangling from her ankle. He didn't say a word. He simply crouched, his large frame easily folding. He took her foot in his hand, his touch surprisingly gentle, and examined the shoe. He tugged once at the flapping sole, confirming it was beyond repair. Then he looked at her. His eyes, which had seemed so hard and cold in the saloon, held a different quality in the soft twilight. It wasn't pity. It was something more direct, more practical, a simple acknowledgement of a problem that needed solving. Without a word of warning, he straightened up, sliding one arm behind her back and the other under her knees. He lifted her as easily as he had lifted her onto the horse. The breath caught in her throat. She was suddenly in his arms, held fast against the solid wall of his chest. She stiffened, her whole body rigid with alarm. This was it. This was the moment the payment would be exacted. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. But he did nothing. He simply adjusted his grip, settled her weight, and started walking again, his stride just as steady and unhurried as before. He didn't grunt with the effort. He didn't breathe heavily. He just walked, carrying her and leading his horse as the first stars began to prick the deep violet sky. Iris was so stunned. She couldn't speak. She was held in an embrace that was entirely devoid of intimacy. It was functional. Her shoe was broken. She could not walk. He was strong. He could carry her. The logic was as simple and unadorned as the man himself. She could smell the scent of trail dust, leather, and clean sweat clinging to his clothes. It was an honest smell, a world away from the cloying perfumes and stale whiskey of the men she had known. Slowly, minute by painstaking minute, the rigid terror in her muscles began to ease. She was exhausted. The warmth of his body was a steady presence against the cooling night air, against all reason, against every lesson her life had taught her. She felt a sense of security. Her head, of its own accord, grew heavy and came to rest against his shoulder. She closed her eyes, just for a moment, and let herself be carried. It might have been an hour later when he finally stopped. She opened her eyes to see the dark outline of a small adobe house, a single light glowing weakly in one window. Beside it stood a modest barn and a corral, their forms stark against the star-dusted sky. The ranch was nestled in a shallow valley, sheltered by a low mesa, with the pale, sandy ribbon of a dry riverbed curving alongside it. It was a place of profound isolation, a solitary outpost in a vast wilderness. He carried her onto the wooden porch, which creaked under his weight, and gently set her down on a simple bench next to the door. He then tended to his horse, his movements efficient in the moonlight as he unsaddled the animal and led it into the corral, providing it with water from a trough. Iris sat on the bench, pulling her legs up, wrapping her arms around her knees. She felt small and utterly displaced. This quiet, lonely place felt like another planet compared to the noise and grime of red dust. He returned to the porch, wiping his hands on his trousers. He stood before her for a moment, a tall shadow blocking out the stars. She braced herself. He gestured with his head toward the door. "The room in there," he said. His voice was a low rumble. "Rough from disuse. Sleep. We'll sort things in the morning." And that was all. He walked to the far end of the porch, sat down in a worn wooden chair, and tilted it back against the wall, becoming one with the shadows. He left her there, on the porch, with the open door and the lighted room as an invitation. He had made no demands. He had issued no threats. He had given a simple instruction and then granted her the space to follow it. She slowly got to her feet, her ankle protesting, and limped inside. The room was small and sparsely furnished but immaculately clean. A narrow cot with a neatly folded blanket sat against one wall. On a small crate next to it was a tin basin, a pitcher of water, and a sliver of soap. A single lantern on the crate cast a warm, flickering glow. It was a cell, perhaps, but it was the cleanest, safest cell she had ever been in, and the door had no lock on the outside. She poured some water into the basin and washed her face and hands, the cool water a balm on her dusty skin. She drank deeply from the pitcher. Then she sat on the edge of the cot, the thin mattress surprisingly comfortable. The events of the day washed over her: the saloon, the cards, the humiliation, the long, silent journey, the fall, the shocking experience of being carried. It was too much to comprehend. She was not used to kindness that came without a price tag. It left her feeling untethered, suspicious, and more vulnerable than she had felt under Croft's cruel ownership. She lay down, pulling the rough wool blanket up to her chin. The house was silent, but then she heard a sound from the porch, a rhythmic, scraping sound. Shing, shing, shing! The sound of a whetstone on steel. He was sharpening a knife. A cold dread trickled down her spine, chasing away the fragile sense of security. Her mind, conditioned by a harsh life, leaped to the darkest conclusions. The sound was methodical, patient, and utterly menacing in the deep quiet of the night. It was the sound of a predator preparing its tools. All the unspoken kindness of the day evaporated, replaced by a primal fear. She lay perfectly still in the darkness, her eyes wide open, staring at the sliver of moonlight filtering through the small window. She listened to the whisper of steel on stone, a lullaby of potential violence. Her hand crept up, not to her newly bruised wrist, but to her neck, her fingers tracing the faint, silvery line of an old scar hidden in the hollow of her throat, a memento from another man, in another town, who had also begun his acquaintance with a semblance of civility. She lay there for a very long time, her body taut, her breath shallow. She was a world away from red dust, but she knew that evil was not tied to a place. It traveled. She listened to the knife sharpening, a quiet, steady rhythm in the heart of the immense, silent dark, and wondered what the morning would bring. Sleep did not come. Iris lay on the cot, a prisoner of her own vigilance. As the slow hours of the night crawled by, the rhythmic scraping of steel on stone from the porch was a relentless metronome counting down to an unknown fate. Every creak of the house, every distant cry of a coyote, sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through her veins. She had survived by anticipating the worst in men, and the sound of a blade being sharpened in the dark was a language her body understood instinctively. She expected the door to open. She expected his shadow to fall across her. It never did. Eventually, the scraping stopped, replaced by the deep, profound silence of the high desert. Still, she did not sleep. She simply waited, a tightly coiled spring of fear, until the first pale, gray light of dawn seeped through the window, chasing the deepest shadows from the corners of the room. She rose not to a sound from him, but to the gentle insistence of the morning itself. The air that drifted in was cool and clean, smelling of dust and dry earth. She heard the soft nicker of the horse in the corral and the faint, chirping calls of unseen birds. The world outside the small cabin was waking up, indifferent and peaceful. Cautiously, she moved to the doorway and peered out. Jed Knox was not on the porch. The worn chair he had occupied was empty. A small, controlled fire was burning in a stone-lined pit a few yards from the house. A blackened coffee pot sat nestled in the embers, a thin plume of steam rising from its spout. Next to the fire, on a flat, clean rock, sat a tin plate with a stack of thick, golden-brown cornbread cakes. There was no sign of him. Her stomach, which had been a tight knot of fear all night, gurgled with a sudden, sharp pang of hunger. She hadn't eaten a proper meal in 2 days. Suspicion warred with need. Was it a trap, a test? She scanned the area, the barn, the corral, the vast, empty expanse stretching out toward the mesas. He was nowhere in sight. The silence was absolute. The aroma of coffee, rich and earthy, was an undeniable temptation. Taking a hesitant step, then another, she left the relative safety of the cabin and approached the fire. The warmth felt good on her chilled skin. The food was real. The coffee was real. She stood there for a long moment, listening, watching. Nothing. Finally, hunger won. She picked up one of the cornbread cakes. It was still warm. She took a small, tentative bite. It was simple, coarse ground, and unsweetened. but it was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. She devoured it in seconds, her caution dissolving in the face of raw, physical need. She ate another, then a third, washing them down with hot, bitter coffee from a tin cup that sat beside the pot. She didn't look up. She just ate, focusing on the simple, life-affirming act of filling her empty belly. As she was finishing the last of the bread, a movement at the corner of her eye made her flinch. Jed emerged from the barn, carrying a heavy-looking saddle that needed mending. He didn't seem to notice her, or if he did, he gave no sign. He moved with the same unhurried purpose as the day before. He walked over to the porch, dropped the saddle onto a sturdy workbench, and then turned to the water pump. He worked the handle with long, smooth strokes, splashing water on his face and neck before taking a long drink. He saw her then, standing by the fire pit with the empty plate and cup. His gaze was flat, unreadable. He gave a slight nod, less a greeting and more an acknowledgement. "Eat," he said. It wasn't a question or an invitation. It was a simple statement of fact. "You are here. There is food. Eat." She said nothing. She couldn't find the words. "Thank you" felt like a lie, a performance of gratitude she wasn't sure she felt. Anything else felt like a provocation. So she remained silent, simply meeting his gaze for a second before looking down at the tin plate in her hands. He didn't press for a response. He walked over to the fire, poured himself a cup of coffee, and picked up one of the remaining cornbread cakes, eating it in 3 large bites. The silence between them wasn't the hostile, charged silence of the saloon. It was something else entirely. It was vast and empty, like the landscape around them, leaving room for a person to simply be. When he finished, he set his cup down and looked at her. "Come," he said, turning and walking toward the barn without checking to see if she was following. For a moment, she remained rooted to the spot, her fear, which had receded in the face of the morning's normalcy, flared anew. The barn was an enclosed space, isolated, but what choice did she have to refuse was to declare herself an adversary. To run was to invite a chase, and in this wilderness, she wouldn't last a day. Taking a steadying breath, she followed him, her limp more pronounced on her sore ankle. The interior of the barn was cool and smelled of hay, animals, and dry leather. Shafts of dusty light slanted down from cracks in the roof, illuminating a world of practical, hard work. Stalls lined one wall, one of them occupied by a placid-looking mule. Tools hung in neat order from wooden pegs' bridles, ropes of varying thickness, hammers, and awls. Jed was standing by a thick wooden post in the center of the floor. He held a length of rope. "Watch," he commanded. He didn't look at her, his entire focus on his hands. With a series of fluid, complex movements, he tied a knot, pulled it tight, and then untied it with a single, practiced flick of his wrist. He did it again, slower this time, a bowline, the knot of 100 uses. He held it out for her to see. Then, he handed her another length of rope. "Your turn." Iris took the rope. It was coarse and stiff, alien in her hands. Her fingers, accustomed to nothing more strenuous than mending a torn dress seam or serving drinks, were clumsy. She tried to mimic his movements. Her brow furrowed in concentration. The rope twisted into a useless, tangled mess. A flush of frustration and shame crept up her neck. She expected him to scoff, to call her useless. He did not. He simply reached out, his large, calloused fingers gently untangling the mess she had made. He didn't touch her hands, only the rope. "Again," he said, his voice devoid of any judgment. She tried again, and again. On the 4th try, she managed a clumsy, misshapen loop that vaguely resembled his. A small, almost imperceptible nod was her only reward. He then showed her a clove hitch and a taut line hitch, his instruction always the same, a demonstration, followed by the single word. Again, he was not a teacher. He was a demonstrator. He offered no praise, no encouragement, No explanation of why these knots were important. He simply showed her the way something was done and expected her to learn through repetition. It was a hard, unforgiving method, but it was honest. It was rooted in the belief that competence was something you earned through effort, not something you were given. After an hour with the ropes, her hands were raw and red, the rough hemp having scraped her soft skin. He seemed to notice. He took the rope from her and hung it back on its peg. Enough. He led her out of the barn and over to the workbench on the porch where the broken saddle lay. He pointed to a place where the stitching had come undone, the leather flap loose and useless. He picked up a wicked-looking curved awl and a roll of waxed thread. "Stitching a saddle is the same as a taut line hitch," he said, and it was the longest sentence he had spoken to her. Each stitch has to hold the tension of the one before it. He punched a hole through the thick leather with the awl, the effort making the muscles in his forearm bunch. He threaded the needle, pushed it through, and pulled the waxed thread tight with a grunt. He made 3 stitches, his movements powerful and precise, each one perfectly spaced, pulling the leather together in a strong, tight seam. Then he handed the awl and needle to her. She looked from the tools to the thick, unyielding leather. It seemed an impossible task. The awl was heavy and awkward in her hand. She positioned the point where she thought the next hole should go and pushed. Nothing. It barely made a scratch. She pushed harder, putting all her weight into it. The awl slipped, skittering across the leather and gouging a long, ugly scratch mark. She froze, her heart sinking. She had damaged it, ruined it. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with apology and fear, expecting the explosion of anger that was surely due. Jed looked at the scratch. He looked at her white-knuckled grip on the awl. He looked at her face, pale with dread. He let out a breath, a quiet sigh that was not of anger, but of something that might have been resignation. He reached out and adjusted her grip on the tool, turning her wrist slightly. "Lean into it," he said. "It's not about strength. It's about weight." He stepped back. She took a breath, repositioned the awl, and leaned, putting the weight of her shoulders and back into the push. This time, the sharp point bit into the leather, with a final, determined shove. It punched through with a satisfying pop, a small thrill of accomplishment, sharp and surprising, shot through her. She looked up at him, a flicker of pride in her eyes. He just nodded. Again, the rest of the day passed in this manner. They worked in a shared silence, punctuated only by the rhythmic pop of the awl, the scrape of the needle, and his occasional, one-word corrections. Tighter, straight, even. She fell into the rhythm of the work. Her stitches were crooked and uneven compared to his, a clumsy, childish scrawl next to his neat, confident script. But they were strong. She pulled each one as tight as she could, the waxed thread cutting into her sore fingers. They did not speak of what she was. They did not speak of the indenture papers tucked inside his coat. They did not speak of yesterday, or of tomorrow. They spoke only of the task at hand. The world shrank to the size of that workbench, to the smell of sun-warmed leather and the feel of the tools in her hands. In this shared, quiet labor, she began to see him differently. He was a man of immense patience. He never raised his voice. He never showed a flicker of annoyance at her clumsiness. He simply corrected and waited for her to try again. This quiet, steady acceptance was more unnerving than any kindness, because it felt real. It was not a performance. It was simply the nature of the man. He was as patient and unyielding as the landscape he lived in. When the sun was high and hot overhead, he stopped. "Water," he said, and went to the pump. She followed, and they drank in silence from the same tin dipper. He handed her a piece of dried, salted meat from a pouch, and they ate their midday meal standing on the porch, their gazes turned toward the distant, shimmering horizon. In the entire day, from sunrise to sunset, Iris counted the words that passed between them. There were 17. As the afternoon shadows began to lengthen, she finished her section of the saddle. The seam was ugly, but it was solid. She ran her fingers over her handiwork, a strange sense of ownership settling in her. She had done this. She had made something, however flawed. Jed inspected her work, his thumb pressing hard against the stitches. He tugged at the leather flap. It held fast. He looked at her, and for the first time, there was something other than neutrality in his eyes. It wasn't praise. It was a simple, stark acknowledgement of effort. "It will hold," he said. The 18th word. He took the tools from her and put them away. The work for the day was done. As he went to tend to the animals, she remained on the porch, looking at her hands. They were filthy, scratched, and 2 of her fingers were bleeding sluggishly where the thread had cut into them. They ached with a deep, unfamiliar weariness. But as she looked at them, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a very long time. It wasn't hope. It was something smaller, more fragile. It was a sense of possibility. That night, she returned to the small room and the narrow cot. The house was once again silent. There was no sound of a knife being sharpened on the porch. There was only the gentle whisper of the wind. She lay down, her body aching with an honest exhaustion. She was no longer a piece of property waiting for her fate. She was a woman who had spent a day learning to tie knots and stitch leather. It wasn't a choice. It wasn't freedom. But it was something. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in a year, she slept. The 3rd day dawned just as the previous one had. The sun rose, the air was still, and the world was painted in shades of ochre and pale blue. A routine, unspoken and unbidden, had begun to form. Iris woke with the light, washed her face in the tin basin, and went out to the fire pit. The coffee was already brewing. The cornbread cakes were already made. Jed was already somewhere out of sight, having completed the morning's first chores before she had even stirred. They ate in their now customary silence. The food was no longer a desperate necessity for her, but a simple fact of the morning. After they ate, the work began. He did not need to tell her what to do. She saw him retrieve a worn leather bridle from the barn, its reins frayed near the bit, and she went to the workbench, laying out the awl, the waxed thread, and the needle. Her hands were stiff and sore, but they remembered the work. The awkwardness of the first day was replaced by a slow, developing competence. She no longer fumbled with the awl. She knew how to use her weight to drive it through the leather. Her stitches were still not as neat or as even as his, but they were tight and strong. She found a strange, quiet satisfaction in the simple, repetitive task. It was honest work. It demanded her full attention, leaving little room for the ghosts of red dust to whisper in her ear. They worked side by side on the porch, 2 silent figures in the vast, empty landscape. The only sounds were the scrape of their tools and the sigh of the wind. Iris had begun to learn the language of Jed's silence. There was a difference in the way he stood when he was concentrating on a task, a subtle shift in the set of his shoulders. She learned to anticipate his needs, handing him a tool before he had to ask, holding a piece of leather steady for him as he worked. He accepted her help with a brief, acknowledging nod. He never thanked her, but his acceptance was its own form of communication. It was a recognition that she was useful, that she had a place in the rhythm of this ranch. She was mending the final frayed section of the rein, her head bent in concentration, when a new sound broke the morning's peace. It was the sound of a small stone skittering down the rocky path that led to the ranch. Iris looked up, her body instantly tense. Strangers were a threat. Her hand instinctively went to the sharp awl on the bench beside her. Jed had heard it too. He had gone completely still, his head cocked, his hand resting casually on the workbench, only inches from the heavy hammer he'd been using. His eyes were fixed on the path, his gaze sharp and focused. A figure emerged from behind a cluster of sun-bleached boulders. It was not the threat she had imagined. It was a boy, no older than 8, with a shock of unruly brown hair and a face smudged with dirt. He was small for his age, with the wiry build of a child who had known hunger, but his eyes were bright and intensely curious. He wore patched trousers held up by a single suspender and carried a small, lopsided birdhouse made of scrap wood. He stopped when he saw them, his initial, confident stride faltering. He looked from the imposing figure of Jed to the unfamiliar woman sitting on the porch. Jed's posture relaxed. The tension drained from his shoulders, and his hand moved away from the hammer. "Luke," he said, his voice, when he spoke the boy's name, held a different quality. The rough edges were gone, smoothed into something softer, something that almost resembled warmth. The boy, Luke, broke into a wide grin, revealing a missing front tooth. He ran the rest of the way to the porch, his bare feet kicking up small puffs of dust. "Mr. Jed, I finished it," he said, proudly holding up the birdhouse. "See, I sanded the edges just like you showed me. No splinters." Jed took the birdhouse and inspected it with a seriousness that befitted a master craftsman examining an apprentice's work. He turned it over in his large hands, his thumb running along the joints. "Good work," he said, and the two words were a mountain of praise. "The roof is straight, the hole is clean. A wren will find that a fine home." Luke beamed, his whole body seeming to swell with pride. It was only then that his attention returned fully to Iris. He stared at her openly, his head tilted, his gaze direct and unfiltered by adult caution. He took in her worn dress, her bare feet she had given up on the ruined shoes, and the way she sat so still and quiet at the workbench. Iris felt herself stiffen under his scrutiny. Children were honest in a way that was often more brutal than adult cruelty. They saw things and they said them. She braced herself for the question she was sure was coming. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" Luke took a step closer, his curiosity overriding any shyness. He looked at her, then up at Jed, then back at her again, his young mind clearly working to piece together this new puzzle. "Are you Mr. Jed's wife?" he asked. The question was so simple, so direct, that it struck Iris with the force of a physical blow. The air seemed to go thin. Wife. The word was a universe away from her reality. It spoke of choice, of partnership, of a home. It spoke of a life she had never dared to imagine for herself. She was an indenture, a piece of property won in a card game. She was a temporary resident, a problem to be sorted in the morning. She was not a wife. A storm of emotions churned inside her: shame, sorrow, a bitter, hollow laugh that she choked down before it could escape. She looked at Jed, but he was looking at the birdhouse in his hands, his face giving nothing away. He was leaving this to her. She turned her gaze back to the boy. His bright, innocent eyes demanded an answer. She could not lie to him, and she could not tell him the ugly truth. So she found a space in between, a truth that was sad but simple. A small, sad smile touched her lips, a fleeting expression of a world of pain. "No," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Luke considered this for a moment, his brow furrowed. If she wasn't his wife, then her presence here made no sense in his world. Adults belonged in neat, understandable categories. "Oh," he said. He took another step closer, his eyes scanning her face as if looking for clues. He was not being unkind. He was simply trying to understand. "Are you leaving soon?" "Then," he asked, his logic straightforward. If she didn't belong here, surely her stay would be short. This question was harder than the first. The first had been a matter of fact. This one was a matter of future, a future she had no control over. "Am I leaving soon?" The words echoed in her mind. Where would she go? Back to red dust? To another town just like it? To fall into the hands of another man like Silas Croft? The idea was a cold stone in her stomach. For 2 days, she had existed only in the present moment. Her world had been the rope, the leather, the needle, the fire. She had focused on the tasks Jed had given her because it was a way to survive, a way to keep the terrifying uncertainty of her situation at bay. But this child, with his simple, innocent question, had ripped that curtain away. He had forced her to look ahead, to confront the vast, terrifying emptiness of her future. She thought of Jed. She thought of his silence, his patience. She thought of the way he had carried her when she fell, an act of functional, impersonal care that was still the kindest thing a man had ever done for her. She thought of the cornbread he left by the fire each morning. She thought of the quiet satisfaction of her work-sore hands. This place, for all its silence and uncertainty, was the safest she had been in years. The idea of leaving it was a sudden, sharp ache. She looked at the boy, who was still waiting patiently for his answer. She couldn't give him a yes or a no. She didn't have one. "I don't know," she said, and the honesty of it surprised her. It was the truest thing she had said in years. She did not know. For the first time, she was admitting to herself that she was not just a passive object being moved from one place to another. There was a part of her, a small, newly awakened part, that had a stake in the answer. Luke seemed to accept this. "I don't know," was an answer he could understand. He nodded solemnly. Then his attention was captured by the bridle she had been mending. "Did you fix that?" he asked, pointing with a grubby finger. "I did," Iris said, a flicker of pride in her voice. "Mister, Jed says you have to pull the stitches tight, or the whole thing falls apart when the horse pulls," he said, reciting a lesson clearly learned by heart. "He's right," she agreed. Jed, who had been silent throughout the exchange, placed the birdhouse on the porch railing. "Luke," he said, "the water trough for the mule is low." It was a gentle dismissal. Luke understood immediately. "Yes, sir," he said. He gave Iris one last, curious glance and then ran off toward the barn, his small legs pumping. The silence that returned was different. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the boy's questions, which hung in the air between them. "Are you his wife? Are you leaving soon?" Iris did not pick up her tools immediately. She sat there, her hands resting on the mended leather. She was acutely aware of Jed standing nearby. She could feel his presence, a solid, grounding weight in her turbulent thoughts. She dared to look at him. He wasn't looking at her. His gaze was on the distant mesas, his profile sharp and stark against the bright sky. But her way of seeing him had changed. Before, she had seen a stranger, a captor, a man of potential violence whose quietness was a mask for some unknown intent. She had watched him with the wary, calculating eyes of prey. Now, as she looked at him, she saw the man who had taught a small, fatherless boy how to build a birdhouse. She saw the man who had gently corrected that boy, and who had just as gently corrected her. She saw the man who had created this small, quiet pocket of order and purpose in the middle of a chaotic, dangerous world. He was still a stranger. He was still the man who held the paper that claimed ownership of her next year. The fear had not vanished, but it was now joined by something else, something new and fragile, a flicker of curiosity, a sliver of trust, a dawning realization that his silence might not be a mask for cruelty, but simply his nature. He was not a man of words. He was a man of actions, and his actions carrying her, feeding her, teaching her were at odds with everything she had ever known. He turned his head then, and his eyes met hers. His expression was as unreadable as ever, but she did not look away. She did not drop her gaze in submission or fear. She held it. For a long, silent moment, they simply looked at each other. The boy's questions remained unanswered, but in that shared glance, something shifted. A wall had been breached. The space between them, once a chasm of fear and uncertainty, now held the tentative, unspoken possibility of something else. She didn't know what it was, but she knew, with a certainty that resonated deep in her soul, that she did not want to leave. The days that followed Luke's visit settled into a new kind of quiet. It was no longer the silence of unfamiliarity, but the shared quiet of routine. Iris now moved about the small ranch with a growing sense of purpose. She knew the particular squeak of the pump handle, the way the morning sun first touched the highest point of the mesa, and the exact amount of coffee Jed preferred in the pot. The work was hard. Her hands were permanently calloused, but for the first time in her life, she felt the solid ground of competence beneath her feet. She was no longer just an object that had been moved. She was a part of the rhythm of the place. She and Jed still rarely spoke. Their communication had evolved into a language of gestures and shared tasks. When he began reshoeing the mule, she was there with the tools before he had to ask. When she struggled to lift a heavy bucket of water, his hand would appear to take it from her without a word. The space between them was no longer a chasm of fear, but a comfortable distance built on mutual respect for the work. She had stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop. For the moment, his quiet patience would curdle into the familiar cruelty she had known from other men. She had started to believe it never would. It was on the 5th day of her stay that the rhythm was broken. It began as a dark speck on the shimmering horizon, a slow-moving dot against the vast, indifferent blue of the sky. Jed saw it first. He was on the roof of the barn, patching a section of weathered adobe, and he went utterly still, a silhouette against the sun. Iris, who was scrubbing a pot by the water pump, felt the change in the atmosphere before she understood its cause. The air, which had been filled with the scrape of his trowel and the whisper of the wind, was suddenly silent. She looked up and followed his gaze. A lone rider. Her blood ran cold. In this isolated place, a visitor was not a casual occurrence. It was an event, and rarely a good one. Her first instinct, born of years of survival, was to disappear. She quickly gathered her things and slipped back into the relative darkness of the barn, positioning herself behind a stack of hay bales near a wide crack in the wooden wall. From here, she could see the porch and the path leading to the ranch, but she could not be easily seen. The rider approached at a steady, unhurried pace. He was not a man accustomed to hard travel. He rode a fine-looking sorrel, and his clothes, though dusty, were of a better cut than those of a common cowhand. As he drew closer, Iris could make out his features. He had a fleshy face that was too friendly, a wide smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, and a silver-plated pistol strapped to his hip, worn more for show than for work. He reined in his horse a few yards from the porch, his eyes scanning the ranch with a practiced, appraising gaze. Jed was already down from the roof, moving with a silent swiftness that was startling. He stood on the porch, his arms loose at his sides, his expression unreadable. He looked like a part of the landscape, as solid and immovable as the rocks behind him. "Howdy," the stranger called out, his voice smooth and confident. "Quite a place you've got out here. A man could get lost looking for it." Jed said nothing. He just watched. The stranger dismounted, his movements a little too deliberate, a little too graceful. "The name's Cobb. I was told in Red Dust that if a man needed a guide through the Black Creek Badlands, Jed Knox was the one to ask." Iris's breath caught in her throat. Red Dust. The name alone brought back the smell of stale beer and humiliation. Jed's gaze remained steady. "Maybe?" Cobb chuckled, a sound that was meant to be charming but landed flat in the heavy silence. "Not a man of many words." "Are you? I respect that. I'm a geological surveyor. My company believes there's a rich silver vein running through the heart of those badlands. They're paying well, very well, for a man who can get me in and out in one piece." From her hiding place, Iris watched, her heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. The man, Cobb, seemed plausible enough. His story was solid, but there was something about him, the manufactured smile, the restless quality of his eyes that set every nerve in her body on edge. "Where to?" Jed asked, his voice a low rumble. "A place called Scorpion Draw. The old maps say it's about a 2-day ride from here, if you know the way." I'm told it's difficult country. Treacherous. It is, Jed confirmed. That's why I need the best, Cobb said, spreading his hands in a gesture of magnanimous honesty. And the pay is good. $100 in gold. Half now. Half when we get back. $100. It was a fortune. Enough to change a man's life. Iris watched Jed's face, searching for any reaction. But there was none. He was a stone wall. She found herself holding her breath, praying he would say no, that he would send this smiling, unsettling man on his way. She didn't want anyone from Red Dust here. She didn't want that world to touch this one. And then the man spoke again, his voice dropping into a more conspiratorial tone as he leaned against a porch post. Heard a funny story back in town, Cobb said, a smirk playing on his lips. Something about Silas Croft losing more than just his money at the poker table. Something about him losing his temper, and a pretty little thing he was keeping. The words, oily and familiar, slithered into the barn and wrapped around Iris's heart. Squeezing the air from her lungs, the blood drained from her face. It wasn't just the words. It was the voice, the specific cadence, the sneering undertone. She knew that voice, a memory, sharp and vivid. Flashed in her mind the smoky interior of the rusty spur, the mocking laughter. A group of men standing behind Silas Croft's chair, their faces alight with cruel amusement. This man, Cobb, had been one of them. He had been standing right behind Croft, his face flushed, laughing the loudest when Croft had thrown her indenture papers on the table. A wave of nausea and terror washed over her. This was not a geological surveyor. This was one of Croft's men. This was not a job offer. It was a trap. The story about silver, the $100 in gold, it was all a lie. A carefully constructed lure to draw Jed away from the ranch, to lead him into the Badlands, to lead him to his death. She watched as Jed considered the man's words, his face still an impassive mask. He looked from Cobb to the distant, jagged line of the Black Creek Badlands on the horizon. After a long, agonizing silence, he gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Be ready to ride at dawn," Jed said. Cobb's smile widened, a triumphant, predatory gleam in his eyes. "Excellent. I knew you were a practical man. I'll make camp a mile down the trail. See you in the morning. Knox." He mounted his horse, gave a mock salute, and rode away, whistling a jaunty, tuneless melody that grated on the quiet air. Iris remained frozen in the barn, her body shaking. He was going. Jed was going to walk right into their trap. He didn't know. He couldn't know. She had to tell him, but how the fragile peace between them was built on a foundation of silence and work. She had no claim on him. She was his property, his winnings. Why would he believe her over the promise of $100 in gold, accusing a man like Cobb was dangerous? If she was wrong, Jed's anger would be swift and absolute. If she was right, and he didn't believe her, the consequences were unthinkable. She waited until the sound of Cobb's horse had completely faded. She saw Jed turn and walk toward the house, his stride as measured and steady as always. Her fear was a physical thing, a cold, metallic taste in her mouth, but it was overshadowed by a new, fiercer emotion. She would not let this happen. This quiet man had, in his own way, saved her. He had given her a place to sleep, food to eat, and work for her hands. He had treated her not with kindness, but with a form of respect that was more valuable than any soft word. He had shielded her from the world that Cobb represented. Now, it was her turn. Taking a deep, shaky breath, she stepped out of the barn and into the harsh sunlight. She walked toward him as he was about to step onto the porch. "Jed," she said. His name felt strange on her tongue. It was the first time she had ever said it. He stopped and turned to face her, his expression questioning. She had to force the words out. Her voice was thin and reedy. "The man, Cobb," she swallowed hard, her throat dry. "I know him." Jed's eyes narrowed slightly. He didn't speak. He just waited, his stillness an invitation for her to continue. "He was in the saloon," she said, the words coming in a rush now. "In red dust, the night of the card game. He was with Silas Croft, standing right behind him, laughing." She finished, her chest heaving, her eyes locked on his. She had laid her truth before him, a fragile, dangerous offering. This was the moment. He would either believe her or cast her aside. Jed Knox looked at her for a long, silent moment. She could see him processing her words, weighing them against the stranger's offer. His face was a landscape of sun-weathered lines, impossible to read. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. Then he gave a single sharp nod. That was all, just a nod, but it was everything. It was not a dismissal. It was not a demand for more proof. It was an acceptance. It was a validation. In that one simple gesture, he told her that he believed her. A silent, unbreakable alliance was forged on the dusty ground between them. The relief that flooded through Iris was so powerful, it almost buckled her knees. He believed her. He turned and went inside the house. The rest of the afternoon passed in a taut, purposeful quiet. The routine of the ranch was abandoned. Iris watched from the porch as Jed began to prepare, not for a 2-day survey trip, but for something else entirely. He brought out his firearms, the heavy Colt revolver from his hip, and a long Winchester rifle she hadn't seen before. He sat on the porch steps and methodically, meticulously, cleaned them. He didn't rush. He oiled each part, checked each mechanism, his movements economical and precise. He laid out the cartridges in neat rows, counting them. There was no anger in his actions, no sign of fear. There was only a cold, deadly focus. He was a craftsman preparing his tools. He gathered supplies, canteens of water, a pouch of dried meat, a handful of medical supplies. It was a kit for survival, or for a siege. As dusk began to settle, casting long, purple shadows across the valley, he did something that chilled her to the bone. He took a shovel from the barn and walked to a spot behind the house, near a large, flat stone. He dug a small, deep hole. From inside his duster, he removed a small, heavy-looking leather pouch tied with a drawstring. He held it for a moment, then dropped it into the hole. He filled the hole back in, carefully replacing the dirt and tamping it down with his boots. He took a broom from the porch and swept the loose dirt away, scattering it until the ground looked undisturbed. He was hiding his valuables. He was preparing for a fight. He was preparing for the possibility that the ranch would be overrun, or that he might not be there to protect it. When he was done, he came back to the porch and sat in the worn chair, the newly cleaned Winchester resting across his lap. He looked out into the gathering darkness, toward the trail where Cobb had disappeared. He was a silent sentinel, a man preparing to meet the violence that was coming for them. Iris watched him from the doorway, her fear for him a sharp ache in her chest. The quiet ranch was no longer a sanctuary. It was about to become a battleground, and she, who had spent her entire life running from trouble, knew that this time she would not run. The sun bled out of the sky, and a deep, star-dusted blackness settled over the high desert. The world shrank to the small circle of yellow light cast by the single lantern Jed had placed on the porch railing. He had not moved from his chair. The Winchester lay across his lap, a patient extension of his own stillness. He was a statue carved from shadow and resolve. Inside the small house, Iris found she could not rest. The silence was a living thing, a tautly stretched animal skin that vibrated with unspoken tension. Every rustle of the wind against the adobe walls, every distant, lonely cry of a night bird, sounded like a footstep. She had found Luke curled up asleep in the barn, having decided that helping Jed with the animals was more interesting than walking home. Jed had simply nodded when she'd told him, and they had let the boy sleep in a pile of clean hay. Now, his presence was a new, sharp weight on her heart. The thought of the impending violence touching the boy's innocent world was a horror she couldn't bear. She made coffee. The simple, familiar task, a small anchor in a sea of anxiety. She brought a cup out to Jed. He took it from her without a word, his eyes never leaving the darkness of the trail. She stood by the porch post, wrapping her arms around herself, not against a physical chill, but against the cold dread that had settled deep in her bones. She had seen violence before. She had been its object, its victim, but she had never before stood on the precipice of it, waiting for it to arrive, allied with someone who intended to meet it head-on. Hours passed. The moon, a sliver of bone white, climbed high into the sky. The coffee in Jed's cup grew cold. Iris's initial, frantic fear had burned itself out, leaving behind a strange, clear-headed calm. She was no longer just afraid. She was a part of this. Her warning had set this night in motion. Her fate was tied to the silent man in the chair and the outcome of the coming fight. It was well after midnight when it happened. There was no grand announcement, no thunder of hooves. It was a single, unnatural sound, the soft whicker of a horse that had scented other animals. Quickly stifled. It was a sound a traveler might miss, but to a man like Jed, it was a gunshot. He was on his feet in one fluid, silent motion. The Winchester was no longer resting on his lap. It was held at the ready, a part of him. His eyes, fixed on the darkness, seemed to pierce the veil of the night. "Iris," he said, his voice a low, urgent command. "The boy, get him to the barn, the back stall, behind the mule. Stay down and stay quiet, no matter what you hear." There was no room for argument in his tone. It was the voice of a man who dealt in absolutes. She didn't hesitate. She ran to the barn, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Luke was still asleep, his face peaceful in the dim moonlight filtering through the cracks. She shook him gently. "Luke, wake up. We have to hide." He woke with a sleepy confusion that quickly turned to fear as he saw the look on her face. He didn't cry or protest. His young life had already taught him to recognize danger. He took her hand, his small fingers gripping hers tightly, and let her lead him. She guided him to the rearmost stall, a small, dark space that smelled of hay and the warm, earthy scent of the mule. "In here," she whispered, pushing him gently behind the animal, who shifted and snorted softly at the intrusion. "Get down low, against the wall, and don't make a sound. Understand?" He nodded, his eyes wide and dark in the gloom. She crouched down beside him, pulling him close, her body forming a shield around his. She could feel the tremors running through his small frame. She put a finger to her lips, and he nodded again, pressing his face into her side. Through a crack between the wooden slats of the stall, she had a narrow, fragmented view of the yard in front of the house. It was a sliver of moon-drenched silver and inky black shadow. She saw Jed step off the porch, moving away from the lantern's light and melting into the deeper shadows beside the water trough. He was no longer a man. He was a piece of the night, waiting. Moments later, they appeared, 3 figures on foot, moving with a confident swagger, their boots crunching softly on the gravelly earth. They were dark shapes, their rifles held loosely in their hands. They stopped in the center of the yard, their forms stark and menacing in the moonlight. One of them was Cobb, his self-assured posture recognizable even from a distance. Knox Cobb's voice cut through the night, artificially loud and full of false bonhomie. "A bit of a change of plans. Thought we'd ride out tonight instead of morning. Save us some time in the sun." Silence. Jed did not answer. He did not move. The yard was as still as a grave. Cobb chuckled. A humorless, ugly sound. "No need to be shy. We know you're here." Silas Croft sends his regards. He's decided he wants his property back. Both pieces of it. He gestured with his rifle toward the house. "The girl, and the gold you took off him." Iris's stomach clenched. So that was it, not just her. Croft's wounded pride demanded everything. One of the other men, a large, barrel-chested figure, grew impatient. "Enough talk. Cobb, Let's just go in and get her." "Patience, Harlan," Cobb said, though his own voice was starting to fray around the edges. Jed's silence was clearly unnerving them. It was unnatural. A cornered man was supposed to plead, or bargain, or curse. He wasn't supposed to become part of the scenery. "We want to do this easy. No need for anyone to get hurt. Just send out the girl, throw out the gold, and we'll be on our way." "From the shadows," Jed's voice finally came. It was not the voice of a man in fear. It was as cold and flat as a stone. "Leave." The single word hung in the air, a final, unadorned warning. Cobb laughed again, but this time it was strained, high-pitched. "Leave now." "Knox, you're in no position to be giving orders. There are 3 of us. 1 of you. Do the math." Jed's response was another long, heavy silence. He was letting their own nerves do his work for him. The third man, a wiry, twitchy figure, shifted his weight from foot to foot. "I don't like this," he muttered, his voice just loud enough for Iris to hear. "Let's just rush him." "Quiet, you fool," Cobb hissed. He raised his voice again, his false confidence completely gone, replaced by a raw, angry edge. "Last chance. Knox, send her out, or we burn this whole place to the ground with you in it." Iris saw it happen. A split second of motion in the moonlight. Cobb, in his frustration, raised his rifle to point it at the house. It was the signal Jed had been waiting for. The night exploded. The crack of Jed's Winchester was a single, deafening roar that echoed off the mesas. It was followed instantly by a choked grunt of pain and the heavy thud of a body hitting the dirt. The big man, Harlan, crumpled to the ground and did not move. Before the other 2 could even react to their companion's fall, Jed had levered another round into the chamber. The wiry man panicked. He let out a yell of terror and fired his rifle wildly into the darkness where Jed was hidden. The shot went wide, splintering wood on the corner of the barn, making Iris flinch and pull Luke tighter against her. Another blast from the Winchester. The wiry man screamed, a high, thin sound of agony, as the shot caught him in the leg. He dropped his rifle and went down, clutching his thigh, writhing in the dust. It had taken less than 5 seconds. 2 men were down. Cobb, who had frozen in shock, finally broke. He was not a fighter. He was a bully and a talker. He dove for cover behind the low stone wall of the corral, firing his own rifle frantically toward the water trough. A spray of bullets hammered into the wood, sending splinters flying. One of the shots ricocheted with a high-pitched whine. Iris saw Jed stumble. A low grunt, a sound of pure animal pain, was ripped from his throat. He staggered back a step, his left arm hanging limp at his side. He'd been hit. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Iris. He was hurt. He was alone. But the panic lasted only a second, burned away by a white-hot surge of adrenaline. Even wounded, Jed was not finished. He leaned heavily against the trough for support, bringing the Winchester up with his one good arm. The movement was slower, labored, but no less deadly. He sighted down the long barrel, a dark, avenging angel in the moonlight. Cobb saw him. He saw the finality in that steady aim. With a cry of pure terror, he scrambled to his feet. He abandoned his wounded companion. He abandoned his mission. He turned and ran, sprinting blindly into the darkness of the desert, his footsteps frantic and fading. Jed held his aim for a moment, then lowered the rifle. He did not shoot a running man in the back. The night was suddenly, shockingly silent. The only sounds were the whimpering of the man on the ground with the shattered leg and the ragged, pained breaths of Jed Knox, who was leaning against the water trough, a dark stain spreading rapidly across his shoulder and chest. For a moment, Iris was frozen, her mind struggling to process the aftermath. The acrid smell of gunpowder hung heavy in the air. 2 bodies lay in the yard. One of them was moving. She looked at Luke. He was staring at the crack in the wall, his small face pale. his eyes wide with a horror no child should ever have to witness. She put a hand on his cheek, turning his face away. "It's over," she whispered, her voice surprisingly steady. "Stay here. Don't move. Don't look." He nodded, burying his face back in her side. She left him then. She pushed open the stall door and ran out of the barn. She did not look at the bodies. She did not spare a glance for the wounded man who was now trying to crawl away. Her entire world had narrowed to a single point, the dark, solitary figure of Jed Knox, slumped against the trough, his life bleeding out into the thirsty New Mexico dirt. She ran to him, her bare feet heedless of the sharp rocks and gravel. He looked up as she approached, his face a pale, sweat-sheened mask in the moonlight. His eyes were clouded with pain, but they were focused. "Iris," he rasped, his voice tight. "The boy!" "He's safe," she said, her voice catching. "He's in the barn." She reached him, her small frame stopping just before him. She could see the wound now, a dark, ugly tear in the fabric of his shirt and the flesh beneath. Blood, black in the moonlight, was welling up from it, a terrifying amount. He was leaning all his weight on his good arm, the Winchester still clutched in his hand. She didn't know what to do. She had no medical training, no knowledge of how to treat a wound like this. All she had was a desperate, overwhelming need to keep this man from falling. She stepped forward, into the space between him and the trough. She put her arms around his waist, her shoulder pressing into his solid, uninjured side, taking on some of his weight. He was heavy, a dead weight of muscle and bone, and he sagged against her. His head dropped, his chin resting on her shoulder, his ragged breath hot against her neck. She could feel the tremors of pain and exhaustion racking his body. She held him, her arms wrapped tightly around him, her cheek pressed against the rough fabric of his duster. And in that moment, as she stood in the silent, blood-soaked yard, holding the man who had saved her, she noticed something strange. Her hands, which had trembled with fear for hours, were perfectly steady. They were not the hands of a victim. They were the hands of a woman who was holding on, a woman who would not let go. The world came back to Jed Knox in pieces. First, a dull, throbbing ache in his shoulder that pulsed in time with his own weak heartbeat. Then, the rough texture of a wool blanket against his skin. Finally, the low, flickering light of a lantern painting unsteady shadows on the ceiling of his own room. He tried to move, to push himself up, but a fresh, searing wave of pain washed over him, stealing his breath and pinning him to the cot. He let out a low groan, the sound foreign and weak in the quiet room. A shadow moved beside him. He blinked, his vision slowly clearing, and saw Iris. Her face was pale in the lantern light, with dark, bruised-looking circles under her eyes, but her expression was one of fierce, unwavering concentration. She held a damp cloth, which she gently placed on his forehead. The coolness of it was a small mercy in a sea of fire. "Lie still," she said. Her voice was soft, but it held a new and unfamiliar note of command. "You've a fever." He tried to speak, to ask about the boy, about the men, but his throat was a desert, and the only sound that emerged was a dry rasp. She seemed to understand. "Luke is asleep," she said, anticipating his question. "He's safe. The others are gone." "Gone?" The word was a final, heavy stone dropped into a deep well. He remembered the fight in flashes, the crack of his Winchester, the grunt of a man falling, the searing impact in his shoulder, Cobb's panicked flight into the darkness. He remembered stumbling, the world tilting, and then nothing. Nothing but the surprising strength of her small frame holding him up, a steady anchor as his own strength failed him. He looked down and saw that his shirt had been cut away. His shoulder was tightly bound with clean strips of cloth, a poultice of crushed herbs he didn't recognize packed against the wound. The bandage was stark white against the grime and blood that stained his skin. He realized, with a dim sense of wonder, that she must have done this. She had dragged him inside. Somehow, she had cleaned his wound. She had saved his life. The effort of being conscious was too much. The fever was a heavy tide, and it pulled him back under, into a dark, churning world of pain and disjointed memories. For 3 days, that was his world. He drifted in and out of awareness, a ship lost in a fog of fever. Time had no meaning. There was only the cycle of pain, the coolness of the cloth on his head, and the patient, persistent presence of Iris. He was vaguely aware of her forcing water between his cracked lips, of her spooning a thin, warm broth into his mouth that he barely had the strength to swallow. He heard her moving about the small house, her footsteps light but purposeful. He heard her whispering to Luke, her voice calm and reassuring. She was a constant, steady presence in the heart of his delirium. On the 3rd day, the fever broke. He woke to the quiet light of late afternoon, the air in the room cool and still. The fire in his shoulder had subsided to a deep, throbbing ache. His mind was clear. He could hear the sound of a spoon scraping against the inside of a pot. A quiet, domestic sound that felt profoundly out of place. He turned his head. Iris was sitting on a stool by the small hearth, a pot of thin porridge simmering over a low fire. Luke was sitting on the floor nearby, whittling a piece of wood with a small knife, his brow furrowed in concentration. The scene was so peaceful, so normal. It was difficult to reconcile with the violent memory of the moonlit yard. It was as if he had woken up in a different life. She must have sensed his gaze, because she looked up. Her eyes met his, and he saw the exhaustion etched into the lines of her face. But he also saw a strength that had not been there before. The haunted, wary look of the girl from the saloon was gone, replaced by the quiet competence of a woman who had faced a crisis and endured. "You're awake," she said. It was a simple statement, devoid of any great emotion. He pushed himself up onto his good elbow, the movement sending a jolt of pain through his shoulder. How long, he rasped, his voice still rough. 3 days, she answered, rising and ladling some of the porridge into a bowl. The fever broke this morning. She brought the bowl to him. He was a man who had never accepted help, who had built his entire life on the foundation of his own strength and self-reliance. To be this weak, this helpless, was a foreign and deeply uncomfortable experience. But he was too weak and too hungry to refuse. He let her feed him, the simple, bland porridge tasting better than any meal he could remember. When he had eaten as much as he could, she took the bowl away. Luke, seeing that Jed was awake, came over to the cot, his face a mixture of awe and concern. "You beat them, Mr. Jed," the boy whispered. "You beat the bad men." Jed looked at the boy, and then at Iris. He saw the shadow of what the child must have witnessed pass through her eyes. "Go see to the mule." "Luke," she said gently, "make sure his water is fresh." The boy, understanding he was being dismissed, nodded and ran outside, glad to have a task. They were alone. The silence in the room was different now. It was no longer the silence of routine, but one filled with unspoken things. He had brought this violence upon them. He had put her and the boy in the path of Croft's vengeance. He had failed to protect them. The weight of it settled on him, heavier than the pain in his shoulder. He looked around the small, tidy room, at the neatly folded blanket, at the clean bandages on his wound. She had worked tirelessly to keep him alive, to maintain this small pocket of civilization. And for what to be tied to a broken-down ranch and a wounded man with a price on his head? He finally spoke, his voice low and gravelly. He didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on a crack in the adobe wall. "You should go." She stopped what she was doing, her back to him. "Go where?" "Away from here," he said. "Take the mule. There's enough food and water to get you to the next town. Santa Fe. Maybe it's bigger. You could lose yourself there. Find work." He finally turned his head to look at her. "I have nothing to keep you here. Iris, the indenture, it means nothing. Not after this." He was offering her freedom. It was the only thing of value he had left to give her. He was releasing her from the bargain, from the danger, from him It was the right thing to do, the honorable thing, and it left a hollow, empty ache in his chest that had nothing to do with his wound. Iris turned around slowly to face him. Her expression was not one of relief, or of gratitude for her freedom. It was something else entirely, something he could not read. She walked over to the cot and stood looking down at him, her hands clasped before her. "For 19 years, she began, her voice quiet but clear, each word carefully chosen. My life has been a series of rooms I couldn't leave, a series of men who owned me, Silas Croft, and others before him. They fed me, they clothed me, they kept me, but they never once asked me what I wanted. I was a thing, a piece of property to be used, and wagered, and thrown away." She paused, taking a breath. "The first night, when I walked out of that saloon, I was terrified. I thought you were just another one of them. Stronger, quieter, but the same. I thought you would take what you believed was yours. But you didn't. You waited. You let me walk to you." She looked at him, her gaze so direct, so unflinching, that he found it difficult to meet. "When that man, Cobb, came here," she continued, "you could have dismissed me. You could have believed his lies over the word of a saloon girl. But you didn't. You listened to me. You believed me." Her voice grew stronger, imbued with a conviction that resonated in the quiet room. "You have it wrong. Jed, you say you have nothing to keep me here, but you gave me the one thing no one else ever has." He stared at her, uncomprehending. "What?" Her answer was simple, but it struck him with the force of a revelation. A choice. The words settled between them, profound and absolute. She was not staying out of obligation, or fear, or because she had nowhere else to go. She was staying because she had chosen to. The concept was so foreign to his own solitary existence, so powerful in its simplicity, that he had no response. She reached up and untied the simple leather cord that held her hair back. It was a worn, frayed thing, softened with age, something she had probably owned for years. It was a piece of her old life, a symbol of her survival. She held it in her palm for a moment. Then she leaned forward and placed it gently on the small, dusty crate that served as his bedside table. It was not a gift. It was a promise. It was an anchor, dropped from her life into his. It was a quiet, unadorned declaration that she was no longer adrift. She had found her harbor. She straightened up, her eyes still holding his. "This is my choice," she said softly. "I'm staying." She turned then and walked back to the hearth, picking up the pot of porridge as if the most important conversation of her life had not just taken place. Jed Knox lay on the cot, his wounded body aching, his world tilted on its axis. He looked from her straight, determined, back to the small, frayed piece of leather lying on the crate. It was nothing, a worthless piece of string, and it was the most valuable thing he had ever been given. 2 weeks passed. They were weeks of quiet, deliberate rebuilding. The bullet holes in the barn wall were the first to be addressed. Jed, his left arm bound tightly to his chest in a sling, directed Iris with a frustrating economy of words. "The wood is split, needs replacing." He showed her how to pry the damaged planks loose with a crowbar, a task that required all her strength. He taught her how to measure the gaps, how to saw a straight line, his one good hand guiding hers on the saw handle until she learned the rhythm of it. Her world became a litany of practical tasks. She learned to cook more than just porridge, experimenting with the limited supplies in the larder beans and salted pork, tough biscuits that slowly softened with practice. She took over the care of the animals, her movements becoming confident and sure as she filled troughs and brushed down the buckskin's coat. She tended to Jed's wound, cleaning it daily and applying fresh bandages, her touch gentle but firm. In this crucible of shared work and recovery, something new was forged between them. The silence was no longer a space of uncertainty, but one of shared understanding. They moved around each other with an unspoken awareness, a partnership that had been earned in blood and cemented in sweat. She would wake in the pre-dawn chill to find he was already sitting on the porch, his face turned toward the east, waiting for the sun. He would watch as she moved about the morning chores, a quiet, assessing gaze that was no longer that of a stranger, but of a man seeing his world being put back in order. The leather cord she had given him remained on the crate beside his cot. He never mentioned it. She never pointed to it. But it was there, a silent, constant testament to the choice she had made. When his wound had closed enough that the danger of it reopening was minimal, he stood on the porch and surveyed the patchwork repairs she had made to the barn. "The wood is mismatched," he stated, his gaze critical, "and we're low on flour and salt." It was not a complaint. It was a statement of fact that pointed to a single, unavoidable conclusion. "We need to go to town," Iris said, her voice quiet. "Yes," he agreed. The thought of returning to Red Dust sent a cold trickle of unease through her. That town was a pit of vipers, a place of whispers and cruel judgments. It was the source of the violence that had nearly killed him. But as she looked at Jed, standing tall despite the sling that bound his arm, she felt a new resolve settle in her. She was not the same woman who had been dragged from that place. She would not hide. They rode out the next morning. This time, she rode the placid mule, and he rode his buckskin. They rode side by side, their pace dictated by the slow, steady gait of her mount. The journey was different. The first time, she had been a captive, riding while he walked, a vast, terrifying distance between them. Now, they were companions. The silence was comfortable, broken only by the creak of saddle leather and the soft thud of hooves on the dry earth. He pointed out a hawk circling high overhead, and she noticed a cluster of hardy desert wildflowers he would have missed. Red Dust looked the same. It was just as hot, just as dusty, just as suffused with a sense of mean-spirited inertia. But as they rode down the main street, Iris felt a profound shift within herself. The stares of the townspeople no longer felt like blows. They were merely an annoyance, like the buzzing of flies. She kept her back straight, her gaze fixed forward, acutely aware of Jed riding beside her, a solid, reassuring presence. Their first stop was the lumber yard. The proprietor, a stooped man with sawdust in his eyebrows, looked from Jed's sling to Iris, his curiosity poorly veiled. Jed conducted his business with his usual brevity, ordering a dozen planks of good, seasoned pine, along with nails and a small sack of flour. He paid in gold eagles from the pouch she now knew he kept hidden, his movements economical with his one good hand. The proprietor's eyes widened at the sight of the coins, his curiosity turning to a grudging respect. Money, at least, was a language everyone in Red Dust understood. They arranged for the lumber to be delivered, though the man warned it might be a day or two before his boy could make the trip. As they were leaving, Jed paused. "We'll get a meal before we head back," he said. Iris's heart gave a lurch. There was only one place in Red Dust to get a hot meal that didn't involve being invited into someone's home, the Rusty Spurs Saloon. She looked at him, a question in her eyes. Was this necessary? Could they not just eat the biscuits they had packed? But she saw the set of his jaw, the resolve in his eyes. This was not just about food. This was about facing the town on his own terms. He would not be seen to be slinking away, afraid to show his face. He was making a statement, and he was assuming, without asking, that she would make it with him. He was right. She gave a single firm nod. The bat-wing doors of the saloon seemed to loom before them, a gateway back into the world that had cast her out. She could hear the familiar sounds from within the low murmur of conversation, the clink of glasses, the tuneless plinking of an untuned piano. She took a deep breath, the dusty air scraping her lungs, and prepared herself. Jed pushed the doors open with his good hand and stepped inside, Iris a half step behind him. The effect was instantaneous. It was as if a switch had been thrown, cutting off all sound and motion. The piano player's hands froze above the keys, leaving a discordant chord hanging in the air. A man in the middle of telling a joke stopped, his mouth agape. The bartender, who was wiping down the counter, went utterly still, his rag poised over a wet spot. Every head in the room swiveled toward them. Every eye was fixed on them. A collective, silent stare of disbelief and morbid curiosity. They saw Jed Knox, the quiet stranger who had broken Silas Croft, now standing with his arm in a sling, a living testament to some unseen, violent reckoning. And they saw Iris, the girl who had been wagered and won like a piece of livestock, standing beside him, not behind him, her head held high. The silence stretched for a long, suffocating moment. It was a physical pressure, a weight of unspoken questions and raw judgment. Iris could feel the stares of the men who had laughed at her, the men who had muttered that she was nothing but trouble. She felt the familiar, hot flush of shame creep up her neck. Her first instinct was to shrink, to look down at the floor, to make herself small and invisible. Then, the spell was broken by a single, braying laugh. It came from a lanky cowhand slumped at a corner table, his face flushed with cheap whiskey. His name was Cletus, a man known for a mouth that was bigger than his courage. "Well, look what the cat dragged back in," he drawled, his voice loud enough to fill the silent room. He leered at Iris, a cruel, knowing smirk on his face. "Didn't figure we'd be seeing you again." He then shifted his gaze to Jed, his eyes lingering on the sling, still stuck with that one. "Are you Knox? I figured she'd have run off or you'd have dumped her by now." The insult was a double-edged blade, meant to demean her and question Jed's judgment. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the room. The men were watching, waiting to see how the wounded stranger would react. They were waiting for the explosion, for the fight. Jed didn't move. His face was a mask of stone, his eyes fixed on Cletus, cold and flat. He didn't need to speak. His silence was more menacing than any threat. But it was not his fight to have. It was hers. The shame that had been rising in Iris moments before was instantly incinerated by a blaze of pure, cold anger, an anger she had never allowed herself to feel before. It was an anger born of 1,000 small humiliations, of a lifetime of being treated as less than human. She had been a ghost in her own life, a silent witness to her own degradation. Not anymore. She did not answer the man. Words were his weapon, cheap and meaningless. Her response would be an action. She took a deliberate step forward, moving from beside Jed to stand slightly in front of him. Then, in the absolute, watchful silence of the saloon, she reached out and took his good right arm, her fingers curling around the hard muscle of his forearm. She did not just place her hand on him. She took his arm, a firm, possessive, and utterly public claim. It was the same gesture she had made that first day, outside this very saloon, but the meaning was a universe apart. That first time had been an act of desperate, silent acceptance. This was an act of defiant, resounding choice. She could feel a tremor of surprise run through him, but he did not pull away. He stood solid as an oak beside her. She turned her head slowly, her gaze sweeping across the room, meeting the eyes of every man who watched. She did not look at them with defiance or hatred. She looked at them with a calm, unassailable certainty that they had never seen from her before. Her eyes finally settled on Cletus, who was still smirking, though the expression had begun to look a little strained. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud. It was not a shout, but it was as clear and sharp as glass, and it cut through the thick, stale air of the saloon, reaching every corner. "I'm the one who chose this man," she said. Her words dropped into the silence like stones into a still pond, the ripples spreading outwards. She let the statement hang in the air for a beat, letting its meaning sink in. "I chose, not him, not Silas Croft, not any of them. The assertion of her own will, her own agency, was a thing of shocking power in that room." She wasn't finished. She held Cletus's gaze, her eyes cold and steady. She saw his smirk falter. saw the flicker of confusion in his whiskey-soaked brain. She was throwing their own filthy game back in their faces. And I didn't bet wrong. The finality of it was absolute. It was a verdict. She had taken the source of her deepest shame, the poker game, the wager, and turned it into a declaration of her own worth and judgment. She was telling them all that her choice, the choice of a woman they saw as worthless, was more sound than any wager they had ever made. The silence that followed was no longer tense and expectant. It was stunned. Utterly, completely stunned. Cletus's mouth hung open slightly, his taunt forgotten, his face a mask of slack-jawed disbelief. The other men stared, their expressions a mixture of shock and a dawning, grudging respect. They had witnessed something they did not understand. A woman they had written off as a piece of property had just stood up in the heart of their world and claimed her own power, using nothing but a few quiet words and a steady hand. The bartender was the first to move. He cleared his throat, a loud, rasping sound in the silence, and turned back to his counter, picking up his rag and resuming his polishing with a newfound vigor. It was a signal. The show was over. The world was righting itself, but on a new axis. Jed looked down at Iris's hand on his arm. Then he looked at her face. He saw no fear there, only a calm, quiet strength he was just beginning to comprehend. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Without a word, he turned, with her still on his arm, and walked to a small, clean table in the back of the room. He pulled out a chair for her, a gesture so startlingly polite that it caused a fresh ripple of murmurs, and then sat down opposite her, his back to the wall, the room before him. He was wounded, and she was unarmed, but as they sat there together, they were the most formidable power in the room. They had not come for a fight. They had come for a meal, and they would have it. The ride back from Red Dust was a journey into a different kind of quiet. It was not the tense, watchful silence of their first trip, nor the comfortable, work-oriented silence of the past 2 weeks. This was something new, a quiet that was filled with the reverberations of what had happened in the saloon. Iris rode her mule, her back straight, her gaze no longer fixed on the ground but on the vast, open horizon. She had spoken. She had claimed her place. The act had settled something deep within her, replacing a lifetime of fear with a fragile, hard-won sense of self. Jed rode beside her, his own silence contemplative. He had seen her in the saloon. He had seen the fire that had replaced the fear in her eyes, had heard the unwavering strength in her voice. He had won her indenture in a card game, an act of cold pragmatism to best a man he despised. He had offered her shelter because it was the decent thing to do. He had stood against Cobb's men because it was his nature to stand his ground. All his actions had been based on a simple, solitary code. But what she had done, that was something else entirely. She had not acted out of necessity or survival. She had acted for him. For them. In that moment, she had drawn a line in the dirt of that saloon and dared anyone to cross it, claiming their alliance as her own sovereign choice. The realization was a slow, deep current moving beneath the surface of his thoughts. When they reached the ranch, the world felt different. The air was thick and heavy, the sky a pale, hazy sheet of brass. The oppressive heat of the long drought had baked the land into a state of suspended animation. The earth was a network of deep, thirsty cracks. The leaves on the lone cottonwood tree by the dry riverbed were limp and coated in a fine layer of red dust. Even the insects seemed to buzz with a tired, lethargic drone. The land was waiting. It was holding its breath. Luke was there to greet them, his face lighting up when he saw them. He had been staying at the ranch for longer stretches, his own lonely shack a poor substitute for the quiet purpose he found in their company. He helped them unsaddle the animals, his small hands working with a new and serious competence. The following day, the delivery wagon from the lumber yard arrived, and the real work began. With Jed's good arm and Iris's too, they started replacing the mismatched, splintered planks on the barn. It was slow, arduous labor under the punishing sun. Jed, still unable to do any heavy lifting, became the architect of the project. He would measure, mark the lines with a piece of charcoal, and then hold the plank steady while Iris sawed. Her arms ached, her muscles burned, but she found a deep and abiding satisfaction in the work. With every plank she cut, with every nail she hammered home, she was not just mending a building, she was mending a life. She was building a home. Luke was their shadow, their self-appointed assistant. He carried nails in his pockets, fetched tools, and offered a steady stream of questions and observations that filled the working silence. He was the lifeblood of the place, his youthful energy a counterpoint to Jed's stoicism and Iris's quiet intensity. The oppressive stillness of the drought continued for 3 more days. The sky remained a bleached, unforgiving canvas. The heat was a physical weight. On the 4th day, something changed. A wind picked up from the west, not the usual hot, dusty breeze, but a cooler, more insistent current that carried with it a strange, clean scent. The smell of distant rain on dry earth. They all felt it. Jed stopped mid-sentence, his head tilted, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Iris paused, the hammer in her hand, and took a deep breath. Even Luke fell silent, his eyes wide as he watched the western sky begin to darken, turning from pale blue to a deep, bruised purple. The temperature began to drop, the air growing thick with an electric, palpable tension. The world was no longer holding its breath. It was taking a deep, expectant gasp. The first drop of rain was an event. It landed in the dust at Iris's feet with a distinct pfft, creating a small, dark crater. Another followed, then another. Within a minute, the scattered, hesitant drops had become a steady, insistent drumming on the tin roof of the porch. Luke let out a whoop of pure, unadulterated joy. "It's raining, mister! Jed, it's raining!" He dropped the handful of nails he was holding and bolted from the cover of the barn, out into the open yard. He tilted his head back, his mouth open, letting the cool water splash against his face. The drizzle became a downpour, a deluge. The heavens opened, and the rain came down in solid, silvery sheets, hissing as it hit the parched ground. The thirsty earth drank it in, the network of cracks disappearing as the dust turned to dark, rich mud. The world, which had been muted in shades of brown and red, was suddenly alive with vibrant, saturated color. Jed and Iris stood under the wide eaves of the barn, watching. The sound of the rain was a deafening, glorious roar, a symphony that washed away the silence of the past weeks. Iris watched Luke, who was now spinning in circles, his arms outstretched, his laughter a bright, clear sound that was almost swallowed by the storm. He was pure, unthinking joy. A powerful, forgotten impulse stirred in Iris, a memory from a life so long ago it felt like it belonged to someone else, the memory of being a child, of feeling rain on her skin without a care in the world, before the world had taught her to seek shelter, to fear the cold, to expect nothing but hardship. Luke ran over to her, his clothes plastered to his skinny frame, his hair slicked to his head. He was beaming, his face scrubbed clean by the rain. "Come on, Iris!" he yelled over the noise of the downpour. He grabbed her hand, his small, wet fingers insistent. "It's fun." She hesitated for only a second. She looked at Jed, who was watching her, his expression unreadable as always. Then she looked back at the laughing boy and the cleansing, life-giving rain. She let go. She let go of the caution, the fear, the endless, wearying vigilance that had been her constant companion for as long as she could remember. A slow smile spread across her face, a real, genuine smile that reached her eyes and transformed her. "All right," she laughed, the sound as surprising to her as it was to anyone else. She let Luke pull her out from under the eaves and into the heart of the storm. The shock of the cold water was a jolt, a baptism. It streamed down her face, washing away the dust and the sweat, and for a wild, glorious moment, it felt like it was washing away the past, She threw her head back and laughed, a full-throated, joyful sound of pure release. She stomped her bare feet in the rapidly forming puddles, splashing mud up to her knees. She and Luke chased each other around the yard, their laughter mingling with the roar of the rain. She was no longer Iris, the saloon girl, the indenture. She was just a woman, alive and free, feeling the rain on her skin. Jed remained where he was, a solitary, unmoving figure under the eaves of the barn. He watched her. He did not smile, but something in his eyes softened. He was watching a miracle. He was seeing the woman she was meant to be, the woman who had been buried under years of pain and humiliation, emerge into the light. The guarded, fearful girl he had won at a card table was gone. In her place was this radiant, laughing creature, her face alive with a joy so pure it was almost painful to watch. The wind shifted, driving the rain in at a sharp angle. It lashed at him, soaking the left side of his body, plastering his shirt to his wounded shoulder. He didn't move. He didn't step back into the deeper shelter of the barn. He stood there, on the edge of the storm, a silent guardian, and let the rain touch him. He was a part of this, a part of her transformation. Whether he was dancing in the mud or not, he had provided the sanctuary. He had built the walls that had allowed her to finally feel safe enough to let hers down. After a few minutes of wild, breathless play, Iris slowed, her laughter subsiding into a contented smile. She became aware, once again, of Jed watching her. She looked over at him, standing there so still and quiet, a lone sentinel at the edge of her joy. Her heart gave a sudden, powerful thrum. She wanted to share this with him. She needed him to be a part of it, not just a witness to it. She left Luke splashing in a large puddle and ran back to the barn, her wet dress clinging to her legs. She didn't stop in the shelter but came right up to him, her face flushed, her eyes shining. Rainwater dripped from the ends of her hair onto the dry wooden floorboards at her feet. She just stood there before him, breathing heavily, not saying a word. There were no words for what she felt. He looked down at her, at the drops of water clinging to her eyelashes, at the genuine, unguarded happiness that radiated from her. His own face remained a stoic mask, but his eyes held a new depth, a new warmth. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his good right hand. He did not reach for her to pull her out of the rain. He did not gesture for her to come deeper into the shelter. He simply held his hand out, palm up, in the space between them. It was an offering, an invitation. She looked at his hand. It was a large, calloused hand, scarred and weathered by a hard life. It was the hand that had cleaned a rifle with deadly efficiency. It was the hand that had held a plank steady for her to saw. It was a hand that knew only work and, when necessary, violence. Now, it was being offered to her in a gesture of pure, simple connection. Without hesitation, she placed her hand in his. Her own was smaller, softer despite the new calluses, and cool from the rain. His fingers closed around hers, his grip firm and warm. They stood there for a long time as the rain began to soften around them, their hands clasped. The world was washed clean, and, in the quiet aftermath of the storm, a new understanding settled between them. It was not the hand of a protector taking charge of his ward. It was not the hand of an owner claiming his property. It was the hand of a partner, reaching for his equal. It was not protection. It was companionship. The world after the rain was a revelation. The air, washed clean of dust, was sharp and clear, carrying the scent of wet sage and damp earth. The sun seemed to shine with a different quality of light, less a punishing hammer and more a nurturing warmth. Life, which had been cowering in the cracks, exploded forth. A carpet of pale green fuzz appeared on the hillsides, and in the low-lying areas where the water had pooled. Tiny yellow flowers began to push their way through the mud, their cheerful, determined faces turned toward the sky. The rhythm of the ranch was one of quiet creation, The new planks on the barn were a testament to their shared labor, a scar that had been healed stronger than before. Jed's arm, now free of the sling, was slowly regaining its strength. He moved with a new, careful deliberation, a man reacquainting himself with his own body. He and Iris worked together, their movements an easy, unspoken choreography. They were a closed circle of two, with Luke orbiting them like a small, bright moon. It was in the quiet heart of a morning, a week after the rain, that the final wall between them came down. The sun was just beginning to warm the porch. Jed was sitting in his chair, honing the edge of a knife with a whetstone, the same rhythmic, scraping sound that had once filled Iris with such terror. Now, it was a sound of comfort, of order, of a man tending to his tools. Iris was in the kitchen, a space that was now unequivocally hers. She was kneading a batch of dough on a floured wooden board. Her hands, once soft and useless, were now strong and capable. They moved with a sure, practiced rhythm, pressing and folding the dough, shaping it into a life-sustaining loaf. The morning was peaceful, marked only by the shing-shing of the whetstone and the soft thud of the dough on the board. She had been thinking, in the quiet moments before dawn, in the steady rhythm of the day's chores. She had been taking stock of the impossible journey that had brought her here. She was no longer running. She was no longer hiding. She was building. The realization had settled in her, not like a sudden revelation, but like the slow, deep rooting of a tree. She stopped kneading. She looked down at her hands, white with flour, and saw not the property of Silas Croft, not the winnings of a card game, but her own two hands. She wiped them on her apron, leaving two white prints on the rough fabric, and walked to the doorway of the kitchen. She leaned against the frame, watching Jed. He didn't look up, but she knew he was aware of her. He was aware of everything. "I used to think I was merchandise," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried in the still morning air, clear and steady. A bolt of cloth, a sack of flour, something to be bought or sold or wagered, something whose value was decided by other people. The sound of the whetstone stopped. He laid the knife and the stone down on the railing beside him with careful precision. He still did not look at her. He looked out at the newly green landscape, at the yellow flowers that dotted the valley floor like scattered gold coins. She took a breath and continued, her gaze fixed on his strong, silent profile. "The first few days here, I was just waiting for you to set your price, to tell me what I owed you for the food, for the roof, for my life." She paused, the memory of that fear still a faint echo in her heart. "But you never did." She pushed herself off the doorframe and walked over to the small kitchen table. She placed her hands flat on its scrubbed wooden surface, feeling the solid, real texture of it beneath her palms. "Now I know," she said, her voice dropping into a tone of quiet, unshakable discovery. "I know I'm a person." It was the simplest of statements, and the most profound. It was her declaration of independence, spoken not in anger or defiance, but as a simple, elemental truth. Jed was silent for a long time. The only sound was the call of a single meadowlark from the fence post. Then, he rose slowly from his chair and came inside. He walked not to her, but to the small, rough-hewn chest in the corner of the room where he kept his few personal belongings. He knelt, his movements stiff from his healing shoulder, and opened the lid. He rummaged inside for a moment, then closed it and stood up. He walked over to the table where she stood. He opened his hand. Lying on his calloused palm was not a coin, not a weapon, not a legal document. It was a small, dark cord of braided leather, knotted with incredible skill. It was much finer than the ropes they used in the barn, clearly the work of many patient hours. And hanging from the center of the cord was a ring. It was a simple, unadorned silver band, worn thin with age, its surface burnished to a soft, dull gleam by the touch of hands long gone. It was a ring that had seen a life, a history. He did not place it in her hand. He laid it gently on the table between them, in the faint circle of flour left by the dough. The dark, aged silver and the rich, brown leather stood in stark contrast to the white powder, a symbol of a long, hard past laid upon a surface of new beginnings. Iris stared at it, her heart beginning to beat a slow, powerful rhythm. "My mother's," he said, his voice a low rumble, "and her mother's before her. It's all I have left of them." He looked at her then, his gaze direct and stripped of all its usual guards. She saw a vulnerability in his eyes she had never seen before, a deep well of loneliness and unspoken history. "I'm not a man for speeches, Iris," he said, his voice rough with an unfamiliar emotion. "And I'm not a man who asks for things. I take what I need, and I earn what I want." He took a breath, the words coming with a difficulty that spoke of their immense weight. "I'm not asking you to marry me. The law doesn't have a place here. Words spoken in front of a preacher don't mean as much as words spoken in the quiet." He reached out, his finger tracing the circle of the ring on the table. "I'm asking to walk alongside you," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "To see you stand in the sun, to have your voice be the one I hear at the start and the end of the day. I'm asking you to share the work, and the quiet, and whatever comes. That's all I have to offer." He fell silent. He had laid his heart on the table, as bare and unadorned as the ring that lay beside it. He had not asked her to be his wife, his property, his possession. He had asked her to be his partner. He had honored her choice by offering her another, the most important one of all. Tears welled in Iris's eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow or of fear. They were tears of a profound, overwhelming joy that seemed to rise up from the very center of her being. A life she had never dared to dream of was being offered to her, not as a prize, but as a shared journey. A slow, radiant smile spread across her face, the same smile he had seen in the heart of the rainstorm. She reached out and placed her hand over his on the table, her fingers lacing with his. "All right," she said, her voice thick with emotion but steady and sure. Her smile widened, a playful, brilliant light dancing in her eyes. "But the next time we go into town, I want to be the one putting my arm through my husband's." She had accepted his offer and raised the stakes, claiming the title not as a brand of ownership, but as a proud, public declaration of her choice, her place, her love. A slow warmth spread across Jed's face, a look of profound relief and a quiet, deep-seated joy that smoothed the hard lines around his eyes. For the first time since she had known him, Jed Knox smiled. It was a small, hesitant thing, but it transformed him, revealing the good and gentle man who had been hidden for so long behind a wall of silence and stone. He squeezed her hand. "All right," he said. "The story does not end there. In the quiet of the kitchen, it ends a few hours later. In the brilliant afternoon sun, the work was done for the day." He brought the horses around, saddled and ready. He lifted her onto the buckskin this time, and he rode the mule. He picked up the small, braided necklace from the table and, with a gentle hand, tied it around her neck. The cool, worn silver of the ring settled against her skin. A comfortable, solid weight, a promise. They rode out not on any errand, but simply to ride. They left the ranch behind and rode toward the valley floor, which was now a vast, breathtaking carpet of gold. The desert flowers, awakened by the rain, had opened their faces to the sun, creating a sea of brilliant yellow that stretched as far as the eye could see. They rode side by side into the heart of it, two small, solitary figures in a world reborn. They did not speak. They didn't need to. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was full of everything that mattered. They were not a man and his winnings. They were a man and a woman, a husband and his wife, riding together into the first day of their life. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment below to say hello. Share your thoughts and connect with our community. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to my channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and like the video for extra support. Consider hitting the hype button to help this story reach more listeners.